All right, we are broadcasting live. Hi, everybody, and welcome to JS.Interactive, the AMA portion of This.JavaScript. Very excited today to welcome a few folks to the round table for our AMA. We'll start with Ben and Igor. Ben is from the, he's the RxJS project lead, and Igor is on the, he leads the Angular core team.
Hi there.
Good pause for Ben. Then we have Chris Fritz, who is from the Vue core team. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Then we have Dan Shaw, who is who's basically, you are Node everything. Dan, I need to, Node at large.
Node at large.
Node at large. Then we have Fred. Fred, how do you say your last name? Is it Schott?
Schott.
Okay.
Like shots. I need a GIF of Dan dancing. I needed it yesterday.
So Fred is part of the Polymer core team, and then we have Ricardo. Ricardo is on the Ember core team. There's Ricardo, and then we have Sebastian. Sebastian is on the React core team. And myself and Taras. Taras is my co-founder. He's CTO of This.Dot. And you've been doing a lot of things lately, like React, Ember React. What else?
Microstates.
Yes, lots of stuff, exciting stuff. GraphQL is your obsession right now.
And GraphQL, yeah.
And then my name's Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLeet. And we can go ahead and get started. So for those of you watching, feel free to ask questions in the live chat. Please remember that we are nice people and be nice to each other. And this is a more of a tech-focused conversation, so any drama, let's try to keep out of it. You know, I think, Taras, I'll let you take it from here with a few questions you had.
Sure. I'm going to start with, we'll go easy and then we'll progressively get more technical. So I'd like to hear about some of the surprising developments that you've seen happen in your community lately. Anybody can start.
Yeah, I can take this real quick. Because actually last time we did this last month, I was a little kind of, with the what's next portion, I'm kind of dodgy. Because we had our big conference about 2 weeks ago now. And then we announced a bunch of stuff there. So for Polymer, we're still in a very early preview phase of this, but we are moving away from HTML imports and onto a more JavaScript, ES modules developer experience. So HTML imports was kind of the last piece of the 4 different technical things we were working towards for web components on the web. There were the 4 things that we've always been pushing for, and the custom elements and the other 2 were going really well, but HTML imports were kind of lagging. So we started looking at ES modules and all the support and the JavaScript community and the browser vendors and just how well that's progressing and how it actually does line up with the original reasons we chose HTML imports. So we're really excited to be doing that and seeing how we can still kind of give the single file component experience if you want to keep writing your HTML, or if you want to write HTML in a separate template and pull it in. So we're kind of experimenting with a lot of new tooling that will make all these cool flows that are possible for web components and the Polymer community. So joined NPM and ES modules, those were the 2 big things we announced, and we're really excited about them.
Cool. And anybody else can share something?
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit since it's kind of related. I think I mentioned this in my previous presentation, but on the next Ember release, we're going to change how the import API works, because Ember has a lot of history, because it has been around for like a couple of years, and we're trying to modernize it without leaving anyone behind. So what we're going to do is use scoped NPM packages. So instead of taking everything from the Ember global, you will do import component from Ember components. at Ember/component, like Angular. That's one thing that we're trying to do. Another interesting thing, this is more from the core team, is tree shaking for the Ember builds. Sorry. And we're also going to try to build Ember on when you build your application, because at the moment we ship a built Ember, so the user doesn't have to pay the costs of building it themselves. But when we do that, it will allow to do tree shaking even more dramatically and do something that we call svelte builds, which is you have the deprecations, but you say, okay, I'm not using anything that was deprecated up to 2.8, and those deprecations are removed from the build. So that allows you to keep up and use the latest version and remove a lot of cruft that we need to support for backwards compatibility because of Semver. There's also some interesting things going on in Glimmer. The Glimmer VM team is basically working on an optimizing compiler for the Glimmer bytecode. You will have to ask Tom Dale, Yehuda Katz, and Chad Yatala for more specifics, because that's a bit over my head. Those were the main things that came to mind thinking about recent developments.
I can jump in and talk about stuff in Node. So recently we moved forward in bringing HTTP2 support into the platform, and that's really exciting. Over the past year, 6 months, we've really gotten the platform of Node.js into a nice stable point. We have some big challenges ahead of us with ES modules, and really excited about where we've gotten in our relationship with the JavaScript VM. A couple years ago, we had issues. We're getting mad with the V8 team about V8 changing some of the underlying subsystems that Node uses, but we didn't really have a good contract with that. And now, through the efforts of the Microsoft Chakra team, with integrating Chakra Core and making that an option, kind of at the build phase, we now have a ABI, so a binding level stable interface with our VM that it really enables us to have a contract with the V8 team and have them be able to run code that says, okay, like we know when we touch this thing, it's going to impact Node. We can go have a conversation with the core team. So that's been really exciting to see, and collaborating with the cloud native space. So we're in Node, we're running in orchestration on containers in serverless environments, and so making sure that in the Node world, we're lifting up our heads and expanding the worldview beyond the JavaScript platform to the needs of the execution environment that we're operating in.
Anyone else want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I can go next. So in the Vue world, right now we have some updates to the Vue CLI planned, where right now we're just generating templates that are ejected out of the box. So you have full control over your build, and nothing is versioned. Like if we make an update to the template on our end, you can't upgrade to take advantage of a bug we fixed or a new feature we added. You'd have to go and add that manually yourself. So right now, something we're planning on doing is coming up with a new system for Vue CLI that's a little bit more like Create React App, but somewhere in the middle, so that it's you don't have to eject once you want to start configuring. You have a little bit more time to configure things through some kind of API, maybe in package.json. We're still working out some details before you have to eject. So you can upgrade your build process as a dependency, at least for a lot of different kinds of projects. We're planning, similarly to now, possibly having a few different dependencies that you can use depending on whether you're building a PWA, progressive web app, or server-side rendered app, stuff like that. Also, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying I've never heard of it called PWA before.
Right?
Really? Am I the only one who does that? This is the problem when you talk to people mostly online.
How you verbalize it in your mind, like, okay.
See, this is it, for me. Like, if I can pronounce something, I will pronounce it. So be careful with the acronyms you throw at me. Some other updates is Vue test utils is essentially done, at least the source code is very close to done. Right now, our main focus is working on docs. And so it's not published yet, but if you wanted to, you could actually go to the VueJS organization / Vue test utils and check it out, try it for yourself. The docs are a little bit rough, but you still, there's something. You might be able to use it a little bit. If you want to try it out. I hope no one gets mad at me for saying that. Don't open any issues if something's broken because it's not released yet.
just start it with PWA and then everything.
Yeah, just try it, and if it doesn't work, like, don't worry, it will work. Okay, and then what else? Let's see. We have on the doc side the official Vue style guide. Is coming out very soon. I'm almost done with that. Then we'll be doing some more review in the team. And then hopefully time next week or something like that. Or maybe the week after. We want to release things when they're done so that when the style guide is done and the ESLint plugin, which is also very close to done, when those are both ready, we want to try to release those together so that we'll have an official style guide for the community and a way of enforcing those styles automatically.
Promises, promises.
Some of them, at least. Some of them aren't possible, but
Igor's wearing
a lot of them.
I have a question. So Igor, I was watching a lot of videos yesterday about like back from NGConf and all the talk of Angular, and everybody was talking about reactive programming. Like everybody was just saying Angular reactive. So do you want to give an update on just sort of where you guys are?
Yeah, sure. So with the reactive programming, probably the biggest development there is the development that is happening in the NGRX community. So NGRX is the solution that allows you to build Flux style applications with Angular. There was a big release, version 4 just happened recently, adding a whole bunch of new features. I wish Rob was here if he could talk about all the details. I'm not familiar with all the details. So that's probably the biggest thing when it comes to reactive programming. We are looking into how to incorporate more of this stuff into the core of Angular, and that's probably going to come in V6.
Yeah.
One of the big features in NGRX this time around was, so if you're developing an application where you have need of creating components that you can either add or not add, so you want to create some sort of app framework built on top of a framework, and you want to create a bunch of component libraries so people can kind of build their own thing. It's difficult with like a Redux style pattern because normally you have your state management kind of like wrapped inside of your component. And whenever you take your state management and move it out to a separate piece, then what happens is every time you add the component, you also have to tie in its state management piece. And I guess NGRX now has this for feature that will kind of take care of that for you. But that's all I know about it.
There were two questions on the chat. One of them was for Fred from Carlos. It's how will the new import work in interoperability with other web component libraries? Are we all moving to modules instead of imports?
Yeah, so I think the community has been moving to modules for a while. I think everyone here, most of your frameworks are written with imports, or at least there's a very import ES module heavy focus, at least from the docs I've seen. So this isn't something new. It is new for us because it just hasn't been how we've been doing things. We've been really liking the HTML-based way of writing things and then actually being able to deliver that to the browser. But seeing that that's just kind of not a reality, at least at this point, we're still really pushing for an HTML workflow. So HTML modules is still something like a real module spec for HTML is still something we're very interested in. But at this point, we kind of just took a look at where imports were and how the community and how browsers were treating them and looking at them and considering them for new features. And it just didn't really seem like it was going to happen in the near future. And we really are trying to get this native web component experience. So with templates and custom elements and Shadow DOM all really moving very, very well through the browser development process and into stable channels, modules is kind of where everything has been going for a native loader on the browser. So we're not giving up on HTML. We still want you to be able to write HTML, and we still want a HTML native module. But as of this point, JavaScript modules are a much better choice for right now and for the next few years.
I have a related development to this. We've been using ES imports and ES modules from the beginning on Angular. And one thing that we realized over the summer was that the way Webpack uses the imports to optimize stuff, there are certain areas where code splitting doesn't work as efficiently as it could, especially if you have libraries that are a collection of stuff, like RxJS, for example, has lots of operators that could be imported from a certain path, or you have a component library where all of the components come from one module path. Webpack currently doesn't know how to subsplit these kind of modules, even though if internally there is a very rich module structure. Webpack doesn't subsplit because it looks at the module from the external point of view, from how developers import this module. Over the summer, we worked with the Webpack team with Stoker on something that is currently being called pure modules. A feature that is supposed to be released later this fall. And with this feature, Webpack will be able to subdivide these kind of bigger modules into smaller modules, which will make chunks much smaller and much more efficient, and it's going to be really cool.
Is that going to be defined by user-defined boundaries, or is that internal boundaries that the compiler is going to separate on?
It's so the code split point at that point, once this feature is in, will become the internal module. So if you have these collections of libraries, you have lots of re-exports happening internally that are not visible to the external developers.
Right.
The external developer just sees the public entry point. And that was currently, that public entry point is the code split point for Webpack today. With this feature, the code split point will move to the internal module structure. So then the developer that is building this library will be in control and will be able to subdivide the library into smaller modules internally that is not visible to the external developers, and Webpack will be able to take advantage of this rich structure.
Nice.
One library that uses single file templates and JavaScript, like single file, I'm not sure what exactly it's called, but Vue uses has their templates in JavaScript in one place. I wonder, is there any consideration in the work with HTML imports that might take into consideration like other frameworks like Vue in that regard?
How so?
Well, is there the work that you guys are going to be doing in HTML imports? Would it make it possible? For example, could it be used, for example, in Vue to load a Vue like a Vue file that has their JavaScript and templates in one?
Yeah. So if you actually look at what a current like Polymer 2.0 element looks like, it actually doesn't look too dissimilar from a Vue single file component. And Chris, you can correct me if that's wrong, but at least in my experience,
no, that's right. Yeah.
I think we both had very similar goals in how we approach that, which is one file, and HTML is a really good interface for you got your template, you got your script, you got your style, and syntax highlighting works nicely. And then the browser can load that. And someone summarized it really well. I'm totally forgetting who, but it's the idea that JavaScript can import other JavaScript, CSS can import other CSS. Why can't HTML import other HTML? So that was the idea behind it. And it gave you a nice interface for then subdividing different content within that. We're still looking to do that, and I think Vue realized this earlier than we did, that you can get the same experience with tooling today without trying to push these different things through the browser. We've always had this goal on the Polymer team to minimize tooling, or to the very least not build, to build for the browser and the platform and not to build for Webpack or Rollup. So even though that sometimes is a difficult choice to make and it can make the developer experience a little harder, we're really trying to push that as a value within the community and to get these things through on the browser platform level. So yeah, like Vue is very similar to like if I was building Polymer today and loved build tooling, which I do because I'm on the tooling team within Polymer. So definitely would have looked at something like Vue. I think that's a really good model. We're still doing something similar, but we're trying to at least minimize the build tooling component of that workflow.
I have a question. This question is from the chat for Dina, from Dina for Chris. Is there any update or roadmap for Vue Mobile like React Native, and is there a good central place to follow the progress or plan?
Let's see. Well, I'd say there isn't necessarily a single roadmap. There are certainly a lot of different projects that are trying to make mobile development easier. So, for example, of course, Weeks is very popular, at least in China. It's used by like one of the biggest companies in China at scale. So it's something that they've definitely put a lot of work in, and that works very well. Weeks, W-E-E-X.
And
I think it is something. Last time I looked at it, the English documentation wasn't completely finished, but it is definitely a project worth checking out. Another option is there's a plugin for NativeScript that's being developed by the NativeScript community for Vue, so that you can use like single file Vue components and a lot of other nice features within Vue easily as a first-class citizen of NativeScript, similar to the support they have for Angular right now. And then there are some other projects too that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but I can drop them in some show notes or something. I don't do a lot of web development personally, so I often don't keep up on those conversations as much. But there are definitely options.
Thank you. Another question I had for, who was it? It was actually for, oh, sorry, there's a few questions. Okay, so let's see. RxJS docs, what's the update? So current update is we have, I think now 35 or so people who are interested.
Tracy's in charge of the docs, just
Yeah.
for anyone wondering why she's doing that. She's volunteered to help with the docs, and she's managing that effort. So
It's your fault, Ben. If anything goes wrong, blame Ben. Yeah, so the docs, anyways, we had a, let's say, I went to the first core team meeting like last week, I think it was. And we sort of got buy-in from everybody that the path that we were going to go down. So now we have a bunch of people, and our plan is to basically get these, 30-something people on who shows up, and then who wants to actually contribute. But we've figured out how we're going to break things down. So we'll probably be creating issues in the RxJS repo and like labeling them so people can actually start doing things. Most of the work is, I think, creating how-tos and then also converting the observables to the new lettable.
Yeah,
right?
how-tos and examples. And it's
Right.
always tricky when you have examples, because I can't tell you how many times I've gotten, well, this example isn't useful. I need an example of that. And then the person goes on to explain like exactly how their application works. So I can basically rewrite their application as an
Just
example.
load my application for me.
Yeah, if your example could just be my app, that would be good. But you know, we do need, I do think we do need a lot more real world examples and cookbook style things in the docs. And that's what this effort is focused on. And there's some other cleanup. Things like right now we're using ESDoc to generate the docs. So we actually build the TypeScript files to ECMAScript's 2015 files and then run ESDoc against it. So ESDocs all point to lines of code in some, like transient code file that doesn't really exist that kind of maps to the TypeScript files. And ideally it would just point to like the GitHub, the line of code in GitHub. So, we're going to try to iron some of those things out too.
And we're also talking to Pete from the Angular team to see what is it called again?
Jenny, yeah. So the first time I talked to Pete, he was like, "No, don't use that. It's too very specific to Angular." And I was like, "Okay, Pete." And that's why we ended up with what we have now. But now he's saying it's probably okay.
So anyways, I mean, regardless, it should be pretty easy to start contributing to the docs once we start adding in all these issues, because they'll be really easy ones where you could just like easily create how-tos. We also reached out to a bunch of community people. I think it's learn RX.io or something like that. Anyways, he was awesome, and we're forming a learning team similar to what Ember has. So. And getting that
it's
going.
It's pretty good. Like I work at Google, yes, but Google is not necessarily, they're not necessarily paying me to work on RxJS. I have a different job while I'm at Google. I do work on it in my 20% time at Google, but Google is not like, we're not really like funding the documentation effort or anything. So we don't have quite as fancy docs as a does or the React team does. But yeah, I'm really excited because there's been a pretty good amount of motion from the community to help with this effort, and hopefully everybody's able to contribute and make things better.
I have another question. Raju, question to all frameworks. Any update on having async await on component lifecycle hooks? Last I heard, React might be coming up with this in V16, but any update on Ember, Vue, Angular?
So let's find out first. Is it possible in React 16?
Not in 16.0. What we're going to do is we're going to release 16. RC came out yesterday, which is basically mostly existing APIs, except where you need new ones. And then we're going to gradually include more and more async features in the minor releases of 16 as we kind of figure out what's the best strategy for adopting async. But we're looking into two, I think this question comes from two different angles. One is, what does it mean to have an async lifecycle, and it varies based on different types of lifecycles. And one concrete, which is pretty simple, I think we want to do is move things like did mount and did updates to async features, which would let them be executed later after you already, like way after you're already mounted, not synchronously right after. And what that lets you do is basically, it's kind of similar to a passive event listener in the browser, where you don't block any other work from happening based on that. So that's good for kind of setting up lazy subscriptions after the fact, or logging is a good example where you might want to do that. Whereas the synchronous versions of these life cycles are actually blocking the screen from rendering because you're still executing within that same event loop. But then there's another aspect, which is kind of the life cycles that happens before you actually finished rendering, which would be in React would be something like will mount or will update. And that could mean things like prefetching, which is a good strategy for kind of getting that early request out before you waste the CPU cycles on other things. And then, but once you get the request out, do you want to block rendering at all from updating? And that's really the key feature of Rec 16, is that we'll be able to enable you to do data fetching in a way that you don't actually result of the current renders. You don't have spinners all over the place and all this stuff. You kind of block the entire tree from rendering. If that tree is already visible in the case of component will update or something like that, then you're able to asynchronously block that update while still being able to interact with the content that was already on the screen. So that's a little bit more of the complex scenario, but that's also something that we want to enable.
I have more questions. Unless anybody else wants to comment, actually.
I just want to quickly comment that I'm not sure what the question means for Ember. You can use async await with some hooks, like the model hook, which blocks the route templates from loading. For the components, I don't think you can block anything because they're callbacks. They're just called when the component reaches a certain state. I just want to note that there's a slight hiccup. Ember has a run loop. It's the Backburner.js library. And Backburner.js uses another library for promises, which is RSVP. And if you use async await and transpile it, it'll use native promises. So there's sometimes some issues there. Yeah, and that's basically what I want to say on the subject.
Well, in the case of Angular, most of our component hooks are synchronous, and we recommend developers that they don't do anything expensive in these hooks because they couldn't interfere with the rendering. When it comes to sending requests or stuff like that, I think using the flux pattern and moving a lot of stuff to reducers is much better than to go about this. For the async stuff, we usually use observables, so async await is not quite applicable there, unless Ben has some news regarding async await.
I mean, well, I just did a blog article recently about how you can use async await with observables, or how observables can be used with async await, and vice versa. I mean, async await, just to be clear, it's a way to do multiple asynchronous things sequentially, right? So that's a very specific use case in the world of asynchrony. And it would be equivalent in RxJS to doing like a concat of a bunch of observables, or doing an observable that switch mapped and then switch mapped again, and well, really merge mapped and then merge mapped again and then merge mapped again, and so on. Like, so you're doing these like async things in sequence. And in that regard, it's fine. I did see a question in there that was about when we would ever have JavaScript syntax for doing something with observables. I'm not really sure how you could really create a syntax for that. The only syntax I was ever aware of even proposed was a loop that could consume observables, which Jafar Hussain proposed. It was I think it was a for on loop. So basically you would have a for on, kind of like a for of syntax, and it would be for on, and then right-hand side of that would be an observable, and every time the observable emitted, it would go through the loop. But as far as creating an observable with syntax, I don't think you could get much more terse than the observable constructor as it is. I'd be really interested to see any ideas people had around that. But yeah, the async await is it's really cool. It's very imperative. Observables in reactive programming tend to be more declarative. I think they work well together in that you can use an observable to manage concurrency a little bit more in a little bit more of a fine-grained way, and with being declarative, and you can use for each, which actually returns a promise when the whole observable is done, which you can then return to your await. So if you want to do a bunch of concurrent things as part of your async await function, you can use an observable for that. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Does the pipe operator, could you use, you were mentioning on your Twitter about the pipe operator. I think you mentioned in the context of chaining operators, right? But that could be a syntax that could work with observables.
So the pipe operator is, yeah, that's a syntax that'll work well with observables. It'll work mostly for operators. It'll work great for things like Lodash. All that pipe or the pipeline operator is a pipe greater than, and what that's going to do is it's going to take the left-hand side of that expression and pass it as the first argument to the function on the right-hand side of that expression. So right now there's an effort in RxJS to kind of migrate all the operators over to being these higher order functions. So these functions where you pass like your map projection and all these things to a function, it returns another function that takes an observable and returns an observable. And the pipeline operator would work really well for that, for composing your observable chain, but it's more broadly useful for other things, functional programming related. That would be like related syntax to Rx, but not necessarily to observables, if that makes sense.
Then in the presentation about Node, there was a comment that Node team is really excited about having more alignment with the features that JavaScript has, like the browsers have in Java, JavaScript has in browsers. Is there are there any other features that that you think, like, what are the features that you have on the roadmap that you think are missing, or were you looking for parity with browsers?
Right. Yeah, so I think there are two key points to that question. In Node.js, everything that we get in terms of JavaScript language capabilities comes from our VM, and that's Google's V8. So in terms of when features are landing at the language level in Node, it's really an upstream reality for Node. One of the things that as I look out farther into Node's future, that I think is important for Node as as really a different operating environment for JavaScript. Most importantly, we're synchronously loading things off disk versus the browser world where you're bringing everything over the network and then you're running that application. So in order to really participate in a meaningful way in TC39, I think Node needs to get more deeply involved in the VM side of things and participate at that level. So the foundations that we've laid with NAPI, which is the subsystem inside of Node now that takes care of the interoperability between the underlying JavaScript VM, paves the way for us to begin having that dialogue with TC39 and representing at the JavaScript level the things that the Node.js platform has that's different from the other operating constraints. And by moving to that level of the dialogue, where things are happening, where things are being explored, then we can expand the influence of the biggest sort of non-browser platform out there, and Node's unique in that respect. And I guess we have Electron now that's loading that with us, and I expect to see more in the IoT realm where folks are running JavaScript on very lightweight platforms, and with that we need more lightweight VMs. The VM inside the browser, it's the install footprint and off you go. But JavaScript in your internet connected device, requires a a VM that has a very different makeup, and Node.js platform needs to enable that and allow folks to be writing JavaScript everywhere.
Is there a feature in Node that you think could do well in the browser? Like, there's been a lot of things that Node benefited from having them just being added to V8, right? Is there anything that you think has grown in the Node world that might actually be good in the browser?
That's a great question. At the JavaScript level, I think that the considerations is we need to be writing one language, and the benefit of Node and browser front end JavaScript is that we can write JavaScript everywhere. So it's important for us to keep that and grow that. In terms of the capabilities that Node offers that's unique, a lot of the glue that exists with Node is gluing to the lower level operating system bits. So our native API versus what we're going exploring with WebAssembly is an area where we have a lot of work to do. So WebAssembly WASM enables us to bring in native code, but it's a different data path than how we load stuff off disk. So I think that the influences that Node brings in terms of sharing different platform perspectives comes from the operating environment influences and just how that changes the framing of the way we work with the language. And most everybody here is dealing with browser JavaScript, and when we're running things on the server, we just have different considerations that we have to prioritize. And so, being at the table and making sure that we can raise our hand and say, hey, we're doing this thing differently on the server. We need to figure out what the way that the language works effectively for everybody in that context.
Yeah, one thing that's really convenient about what Node has is really good module resolution, or at least really convenient module resolution. And so as we see how modules land on the browser and how they land in Node, it's going to be interesting if we end up writing these modules that still don't really run on the browser, because the browser is expecting paths for imports. So import from and then a relative path or an absolute path. But Node is using named imports, and NPM is using named imports, and Webpack works really nicely. And it's really convenient to say, I need this thing, and I've told you what version I need, and then you can trust NPM to put it in a place where you'll be able to load it from. But how that eventually lands, will the browser support that, or will there be some sort of build stuff? Because that is really convenient on Node.
Right. Yeah, ES module is probably the biggest.
I was going to say is that Node's kind of already given one thing back the other direction towards browsers, and that's the module, all the ES module stuff that we have now. I think was inspired by the CJS modules and things like that. For better or worse, like I think that's been a huge contribution from Node back the other direction, because I really can't imagine working in a world where I have to actually concatenate files together myself, because I remember doing that and how awful it was. So yeah, I'm really glad that exists.
Well, there's one area that I think everyone can probably relate to where there's things need to run in Node, which is in server-side rendering. So you guys want to talk about that? Because I think that's one thing that both Vue and React are putting more effort into. You guys want to speak to some of the experiences that you've had? And I know Ember's put a lot of work into, and actually everyone, right, put a lot of work into server-side rendering recently.
I haven't done any. I can
RxJS.
do that.
Tierney, by the way, said ES modules in Node.js is very likely going to land today. And he has a pull request, 14.369. Merge that. Anyway, server-side rendering. Yeah, who wants to start related to that?
I can start. So server-side rendering in Ember is called Ember Fastboot. Fastboot has been around for a while, but we didn't consider it 1.0 because there were some things that we wanted to make happen so we wouldn't break people's apps afterwards. One of those things was that we used to do 2 builds. So whenever you ran Ember Fastboot, you would build once for the browser and then once for Fastboot. And if your app is like sufficiently big, that really heads the app because it's twice as long to build. We've now unified the builds. We solidified the API and released 1.0. A lot of people were already using it. I was using it personally. There were a couple of companies. I don't have examples at hand, but several people mentioned. Ember Weekend, a famous Ember podcast, uses it. And we're now introducing rehydration. So what happens at the moment is that Fastboot renders the whole page on the server, sends that HTML to the client, and then on the client, the Ember app boots up and replaces everything. What rehydration introduces to that is that when it renders on the server side, some special annotations are added to the DOM so that instead of rewriting the whole page, Ember can boot up and say, okay, this was the route X, this is the component Y, the state was Z, and it loads up. There's already something called Shoebox for Ember data, which does something similar, which is it serializes the Ember data store, which is where all your data is, your models, and then on the client side, when it puts up, it deserializes from the DOM instead of making another request. There were a couple of memory leaks on the Fastboot app server that were fixed, and overall, the feedback has been good. And the project is progressing really well, and I'm curious to see the implications of rehydration in the short-term future. One thing more for Ember developers that might be interested is that support for lazy loaded engines is either about to land or already landed, which is something really good because you can split your app into different engines and then conditionally load just when you need it, instead of loading your whole app at once.
Who wants to go next?
I can share a couple quick notes on things that Vue developers might not be aware of, or some Vue developers. As some people may or may not know, Vue has very robust support for server-side rendering. It works really well, but server-side rendering itself is still something that has to be learned. It's really like a new paradigm, and it can be a little bit complex to set up. And so some of the things that we've done to try to make it easier is server-side rendering has its own documentation within Vue. So we have a server-side rendering page that introduces the concept briefly, and then we have a separate guide completely that just walks you through a lot of those concepts and a lot of the tools that Vue provides to make server-side rendering easier in a variety of environments. There's also a community project called Nuxt that makes server-side rendering ridiculously easy. So if you want to just start up an app that happens to be server-side rendered, and you don't know a lot or perhaps anything about server-side rendering, you can still get started and be server-side rendered out of the box in just a few minutes. So that's really nice, and I'd still recommend learning more about the caveats of building a server-side rendered app and reading those docs eventually, because that is still important. It's not exactly the same as a fully client-side app. And then beyond that, let's see, I think there was one more thing I wanted to mention, but I'm not recalling it right now, so I shall cede the floor to someone else.
So Angular, the server-side rendering solution for Angular is called Angular Universal. There have been several major updates in this area recently. One is we changed how the implementation of DOM on the server side to be much more memory efficient. Many of the server-side rendering solutions that use Node suffer from high memory usage in RxJS recently. So that should be greatly improved in 5. The other change that we made is much better CLI support. So once you're building server-side rendered application, you get much more support from the CLI where the project is scaffolded with all the bits that you need to be successful. And lastly, we're working on state transfer management. So in order to render your application on the server side, there's a state that assemble the rendering to happen. Previously, you were handholding that state to the client side with the version 5 of Angular. This would be much simpler. It's going to be dedicated state for that. And the last thing related to server-side rendering, we had a major launch. Forbes, a big media company, had a launch, I think, a month ago, where they used their application that is
Lauren says she can barely understand you.
Yeah, it's the mic is cutting out for some reason.
Yeah, that last little sentence got completely lost.
The last sentence was that we had a major launch. Forbes, a media company in the US, they launched overall of their website that uses Angular Universal for us.
Basically, Angular Universal is awesome, and everybody should be using it if they're using it.
So I can talk a bit about what we're going with React with regards to server rendering. Server rendering was always kind of a big feature of React initially, but the implementation was kind of ad hoc. That was more of an experiment to see, well, we have the implementation of the client, and we can just make it work on the server as well. And we haven't really done much. It's been more of a community effort up until this point. And there's some quirks that we're trying to fix in 16. So for example, we've always had rehydration, but there's some cases where rehydration doesn't work that well, where, for example, you have a timestamp that both changes in time, but also changes in date formatting based on platforms and stuff like that. So doing exact comparison doesn't really work out that well. So we'll have some more escape hatches for small things like that. I think for getting started, there's projects like Next.js, and I think for the short-term future, we'll probably rely on the community more there to getting up and running and kind of having an integrated setup. But we are looking more into the actual implementation itself to provide more features that are kind of lacking right now. In Rec 16, we have a new streaming-based server renderer, so that's a big win based from the previous synchronous rendering path, and should also be much more optimized around the server rendering use case. So it's a completely different code path from the client. But then as we're introducing these async features on the client, then we want to have the parity on the server as well, so that we can do all these streaming, fetching, streaming, rendering from the server as well. And that will allow us to have much more of a streaming pipeline. So a lot of websites today kind of have many different API sources, right? You don't get all your data in one request one time. And even if you are, you probably would be better off splitting that up into multiple pieces of requests on the server where you have lower latency. And as you're getting data in different order, and the orders is very hard to predict, you're basically bottlenecking yourself at different points. So you want to ensure that you can have smaller granularity where you can do computation interleaved with these requests. And we think that making that much more granular will make it better to have automatic redundancy kind of adopt itself. But then we want to take this to the next level as well and kind of introduce a new type of rendering that doesn't just target HTML pure, but can interleave more scripting in terms of the rendering itself and have kind of a richer client engine that pairs with the server rendering, which will probably get us even further on more efficiencies and kind of flexibilities and extensions. So that's more of the midterm, but we're also thinking about much longer term kind of crazy ideas. So all of these solutions that seem to work well today are based on frameworks like in this group that are designed around the client first. And I think that's the right strategy because the client is surprisingly has a lot more constraints than the equivalent to running on the server. The server running part is relatively easy part. There's still a lot of quirks that you have to figure out there to make it really work, but you kind of have to start with the constraints on the client because it's the more limited environment first, and then import it to the server. But we're starting to rethink that a little bit because there's also a lot of benefits from the server. So we might be looking into more server-centric and server-first solutions, or server-only components, or solutions that kind of assume that you have these persistent connection to the server, or at least while you're interacting with things and getting your data, you're starting from the server and then kind of secondarily going to client rendered mode and revive those pieces. But for the quick interactions, you can kind of be server only first. There's a lot more to talk about on that end, but I think there's just a lot more in the space that we haven't explored yet.
Fred, do you have a Polymer SSR comment?
Yeah, I was kind of waiting for everyone else to finish off for the in here. To be clear, we do definitely, now that we're going towards JavaScript more, that kind of like achievement unlocks the Node server-side rendering level of this. So we are definitely playing around with it as we move forward there. My kind of counterpoint to all this would be that we've seen a lot that there are a ton of use cases where not focusing on server-side rendering and completely focusing on delivering small bundles or small deliverables very fast on like the really hot use cases can sometimes be a better experience. So if you have something that's very interactive, where the first thing when a user gets to a page, they want to like click something or interact some way, to have it show up and then be still not interactive for a good second or more if you're on something mobile, can sometimes be an even worse experience where the user is now confused by, is the app broken versus like, oh, well, the app's still loading. I'm not, I like being a contrarian here, but I'm not, a purist of server-side rendering sucks, especially if you have a page where you're reading something or you need to parse it, and that time can be spent by the user reading it while the site continues to load, so like a Reddit or a something like that. But yeah, I think we've focused a lot on proving out with HTTP2 and some other features that purple pattern is something that we've been working on a lot. This idea of delivering as little code as possible to get your site as quick to interactive as possible versus as quick to paint, and then that uncanny valley of what's going on here. So we're exploring both. There's a certain use case for each. I definitely understand that, but yeah, that's where we're at.
So I wanted to riff on what Sebastian said about, touched on about what's happening with server-side rendering. Probably the biggest learning that we've experienced on the server-side rendering and the Node side is putting all of that logic where you're doing your application routing and your rendering and all of your things into one Node.js application at the edge is kind of a pattern for pain once you start scaling. It's not a way that you're going to be delivering data very efficiently. The team over at Airbnb, they're actually serving the edge with Ruby, but rendering all of the React components in a backend service that it's one of those calls that you make out and get past the metadata, and then you have a pool of workers that are dealing with the slow moving tasks, and can take that event loop, process it, hand it off, and move on. So when you're thinking of server-side rendering in Node, you can think of you have your fidget spinner. You got to keep the edge fidget spinner always moving, and
love that.
Yeah, I'm still figuring out how I feel about that analogy.
And the heavy work of integrating the API calls, push those downstream to other services, and that break the monolithic model when you're composing Node.js services, and make sure that your separations of concerns move the heavy lifting that server-side rendering today entails, and off the main loop.
Yeah.
On that topic, it's interesting. Sorry, Chris, you're going to say something?
Yeah, sorry. Do you mind if I add one more thing?
Yeah.
So riffing on both of those, I will say that I agree. Server-side rendering has its use cases, but it has its dangers too, and its limitations, its caveats, and I think it is definitely overused by a lot of people in the community. I think, or a lot of people in all of our communities. I think a lot of people assume that it's just one of those best practices that we should all adopt. We should all have every app should be server-side rendered. And I don't think that's true. And there are a lot of problems that people try to solve with server-side rendering that I think would be better solved with other tools. So for example, if you have a site that you are where you are fetching some content from a backend, and you want to make sure that your marketing pages have good SEO and that search engines can actually read your content because it's fetched asynchronously. Probably a simpler solution to that is either just pre-render those pages, or even simpler, make the marketing part of your site a separate static app that shares the same CSS, shares similar assets.
Pre-published to the edge.
So once you introduce server-side rendering, you are introducing complexity into your application that you're going to have to live with in every part of your application. So if you can avoid it, I think it should be avoided in a lot of cases when there's a simpler solution.
So hold on, are you telling me that I shouldn't work on the server-side rendered RxJS that I was proposing earlier on?
No, I'm saying it has its use cases, but people do, I think, reach for it. Users reach for it more often than it's actually useful, I think.
Well, I agree, and we also should maybe define what we mean by SSR, because if you want to pre-render your marketing page, you can use SSR for that. It doesn't need to be SSR on demand. Gatsby is a great example of building static web pages that get sprinkles of React with the tools you're used to. I've used myself Ember Fastboot to build a static website just because it's familiar to me, and I have all of these tools available, plugins, SAS, compiler, etc. So that's also a good use. I think people sometimes don't realize other potential uses for SSR because they're fixed on that specific case of I make a request, I generate the page, and then return. But I agree that there are constraints, and you should measure and make sure that you're taking advantage of it, and you're not getting too many of the downsides of SSR.
One of the reasons why people do SSR is search indexing and crawling, as was already mentioned. And related development to that was that the Chrome and the search team at Google, they actually published the version of Chrome that is being used by the crawler to index dynamic pages, single-page applications, which is something that was previously unknown, and it was this black box. People tried different things and mixed results when crawling purely client-side rendered application. So there's a document now that is published. I forget what version is it. I think it's like M46, but don't.
It's either 46 or 42. It's quite old.
Yeah. But at least now it's clear what the limitations are and what is the targeted browser for those developers that don't want to spin up the server-side rendering part and want to rely purely on the client-side rendering. Now it's clear what the target is, and that helps many developers, especially smaller applications that don't have the resources to maintain a server-side rendering solution.
Yeah, your content just has to be rendered synchronously for that to work.
No, that's not true.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, so if you're making an asynchronous request for content,
that's totally fine.
Really? How does Google know how long that request will take?
Google.
That's interesting. That wasn't true last time I checked, but that's interesting. I think we have that in some docs. We'll have to update. We can talk about this later, but I'd be interested in a resource where I could learn more about the strategy that Google is using. And to see like if other search engines are using a similar strategy, or if that's still something that we have to consider.
The crawler basically runs the headless browser. Well, this particular version of Chrome, and there are certain timeouts in place to make sure that the application doesn't go crazy, or if you have set interval that could block the rendering forever. So there are some guards in place to ensure that the web page doesn't go crazy, but you can definitely do async stuff. You can make XHRs. We spent quite a lot of time to make sure that Angular.io, the website that hosts documentation for Angular, is client-side rendered and compatible with crawling. So you can look at the source code of Angular.io if you're curious to see some of the stuff. But it's definitely worth checking out the document that the search engine team, I think it was Ilya Grigorik who published the document.
Somebody said, whoa, are you sure? What are you basing this on?
Who are they talking to?
Stop shocking people.
Sure about what?
You just said.
Yeah.
Sure.
Despite the fact that Google can understand your client-rendered app, does it have an impact on the ranking compared to a fully SSR app?
I'm not an expert on this stuff. From what I was told, the search team doesn't distinguish between the stuff that is crawled using the client-side render stuff, client-side rendered method versus server-side rendered. They try to.
I think it only. Sorry, I think it only impacts the ranking in terms of the client-side rendered app will probably be much slower to first paint from just a static HTML page. So it might be penalized for the speed.
And slower to get that content if you have to serve all these assets, serve all these resources to actually load your app on the client side and then go and fetch your content if you're fetching it asynchronously, rather than having it built into that that initial payload.
Yeah, and I think that does factor into the ranking. But other than that, I don't know.
I think it would be good to have some search expert on this because I think everybody in the room is just guessing about how this stuff works.
and SEO is consistently the #1 reason why folks are saying, "Hey, I need to server-side render."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if that bar has moved, maybe we need to reassess.
Yeah. I'd love to learn more about that.
Maybe we should bring somebody from the search team next time.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions about this. Is the low reliability a Google crawler problem or an SSR problem? Should both sides play nice to each other? But I think that's
Low reliability.
Is the low reliability a Google crawler problem or an SSR problem? I don't know.
Is that reliability of search rankings, like of whether Google will?
Probably.
Okay.
I think in the past, the problem was that it was not clear what was used to do the rendering with the crawler, and that caused reliability issues. Because just by application that was previously fully crawled, if developers started using an API that was not present in this particular version of Chrome that was used by the crawler, you could start getting errors, and your ranking could dip.
Okay.
And you wouldn't even know about it. So,
is it the kind of thing where, like, if all of your users are using Chrome and all of them are using Google, then like you don't have anything to worry about? But otherwise, if they might use other search engines or other browsers.
Well, the way I see it, because the search team is using older version of Chrome, if you are targeting evergreen browsers and don't have server-side rendering, there is one more target that you need to be thinking about, which is this older version of Chrome. And before this was unknown, this was very unclear. At least now we know what the target is and work towards it.
Okay. Well, I look forward to hearing from someone on the search team.
So I have a question.
Server-side rendering.
Yes.
Let's pair on that next then.
I was just excited to learn there are other search engines.
Yeah.
I thought that was exciting.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but no, I'm just kidding.
I have a question about server-side rendering and all of the application platforms here. Are you getting to a point when you're building out the infrastructure for server-side rendering where you're bifurcating large code paths? One of the great advantages of universal JavaScript is you kind of keep the programming model consistent from as you're moving from the server side to the your front end view. And those are the areas that I think that as a platform node would benefit from understanding where you're saying, oh, we got to go and do things completely differently when it's rendered by Node.js. Are you getting to those points? Sebastian, I was listening to your description, and I was like, okay, is that a forking path inside of React that and should we even is it Node's responsibility at that point to do better, to do things differently, to accommodate for the browser behavior?
So there's a few of these patterns that come up because you don't have access to the same kind of information. Sometimes you have access to more data. So if on the server you can have access to data points that the client should never be able to read directly, but you can branch on, for example, on the server. And that is something that you have to be really careful about because you don't want to accidentally expose that as a field to the client or something like that. And then there's similarly data on the client for the initial requests. You might not have access to screen size, for example. So there's conditionals that you can't do. Those are more kind of inherent to the problem. Then there's accidental kind of coupling and branching based on what data fetching APIs you might have or how you structure your components. But that's kind of the design space of us as libraries to figure out where do you draw the boundaries of these things. But then I think the big critical thing is that there's the way you get your data is different. The way you want to optimize on the server is for spreading your data fetches to multiple different endpoints. And the same is not necessarily true on the client because you want to be able to unify many different things. And so I think that there's something inherent about the data fetching strategy that introduces a big chunk of work that is forked regardless.
Right.
I haven't really thought, the only thing that I've hit really that I'm now missing in the Node environment is something equivalent to request style callback. It doesn't really make sense in that terms, but the basic thing is that you can't know whether you have different priorities of work in Node. And this goes into like libuv, where the async model is kind of this queue-based model, and nothing have different priorities, and you can't schedule work based on different priority levels. So you can't. The equivalent rendering that we have, we use PHP, a PHP-based system at Facebook, but it's actually really advanced in terms of the scheduling mechanisms in the async boundaries. And I think this is something that is left to be explored on the libuv side, how you can have this IO responses come back that interrupts or have some kind of interrupted mechanism to make them higher priority than other processing models.
Right on. That's interesting.
Should we move on from the Whoopsie. Should we move on from the server-side conversation?
Yeah, I want to. Trace, do you have something?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's one of the questions that came up earlier. It's really interesting to hear. What are the things that your particular framework or your team, when you're thinking about, what to prioritize. What are the things that your team optimizes for when you're building and designing your tool?
So RxJS 5, when I was working on it, was optimized for like computational efficiency. So trying to get as many operations per second out of every operator, and because it's kind of a hot path sort of library, and just trying to get things to be as quick as possible. Now for version 6, what we're looking at is trying to reduce the size of the library, so the download size is more palatable to people for use. So it's like, oh, do I want to use this big heavy library, or that won't be an issue for people anymore. Ideally, it'll be a matter of like better tree shaking and smaller file sizes, and those sorts of things will drastically reduce the size of RxJS. So it's a non-issue. So focusing on, we still have all the performance tests. We want to make sure that those are still up to snuff, and we limit the impact on that. But trying to reduce the size of the library is the big measurement that we look at now as we roll forward. But that's it for Rx though.
For Angular, we're trying to strike the right balance between the optimizing from developer economics, runtime performance, and size or initial rendering, and that can be pretty tricky. I think we did a really good job on the runtime performance. We have a lot of tests, and we haven't even have a lab with the real devices where we run the tests on. These tests have been extracted from large applications, and that's what we test against and make sure that we don't regress on these tests or improving these tests. When it comes to payload size, I feel like we started paying attention to this only in the last 3 quarters, I would say, and we made major progress there, and this is something that we're continually investing in. Again, extracting benchmarks from real-world applications, trying to understand where the areas of improvements opportunities are, and work with different teams, whether it's the core team, the material design team, Webpack team, Uglify, whoever it is, to improve the size.
For React, we focus a lot on getting the developer experience right to some extent, but a lot of that actually has to do with making sure they can solve all the problems that you hit. So there's always escape hatches. There's always kind of these solutions. That's more of it's more about focusing on the edge cases than it actually is about your day-to-day work. It's more about making sure that you never just really get blocked 100%. But we also focus a lot on initial render speed. So that means everything from the initial server load, initial rendering on the server, from the client startup, optimizing bundles, JavaScript, runtime, everything in the pipeline. But that doesn't just mean that initial cold start is actually more as you're navigating. So if you think about Facebook apps, there's a lot of contribution, but a lot of it is read only as well, right? So, and even in contribution pages, there's a lot more kind of opening new screens than there is updating to existing screens. So not this fast interactive, you're touching, interacting, everything else. So even when you think about updates or when you're on the screen, we're thinking about the initial render of large new views. And the most concrete example of that is just all these feeds that we have. It's just scrolling the infinite loading feeds all over the place. Things that just pop up and then disappear again without ever being updated. And then we also focus a lot on, recently we've been focusing on resource contention. So we can solve some of these problems by just stealing all the resources there is available in the system, but we're not the only thing in the system. And there's all these other interaction points. So one aspect is kind of if we just steal all the resources to rendering all the initial things on the screen on Facebook, well, if one of those initial things is a video, that video might start stuttering because we're not feeding it enough buffers quickly enough. So that kind of resource contention is really important to the experience. So that's the thing we kind of recently have shifted to focusing on as well.
Yeah. Oh, Chris, you want to go? I saw you just move.
It's okay. It's okay. No, you can go. You can go.
Well, probably unsurprising, the benefits and the goals of what we're building for are with Polymer are close to the goals and benefits of web components. So a lot of the use cases that we see really working well are maybe you're vending a component for your business or for open source, or you're a team within a greater company who's trying to build for a lot of different use cases where you might not know what framework or what setup your users might be using. Maybe they're in React or Vue or et cetera, et cetera. So we're seeing a lot of really good use cases there where it's a really competitive advantage to have something that works anywhere. And then with the move to NPM and ES modules, that's just kind of getting even easier and better.
Yeah, so some of the things that people really love about Vue right now is that it's like really small for everything that it does and relatively easy to learn. Like we put a lot of work into our documentation and we take pride in the fact that, generally what we hear is that people can become productive in Vue the same day that they start learning it. Which is like really awesome. And then they can feel like really, really comfortable like after just a week. And that was my experience when I first came to Vue. And we have kept on trying to improve that. We make updates to our documentation nearly every single day, including like a lot of community contributions. People helping us fix sentences that are completely clear or a little ambiguous. Cover caveats or special notes in the places that people are actually looking for them. And we recently did a pretty significant rewrite and reorganization to make a lot of things easier to find that people have been looking for and weren't always able to find right away when they did a search. And maybe sometimes skipped over when they were reading through the documentation the first time. And so a lot of what we're working on right now is just keeping that experience like excellent and making it better all the time and keeping the core lean so that there are a lot of feature requests that we get that are like really good ideas. And maybe for like 20% of users, they would like really make a significant difference to their workflow. But is it worth like an extra 2 KB gzipped? We have to make those kinds of decisions, and sometimes it's not easy. And for Vue 3, there are some things, as we drop support for older browsers, there are some things that we'll be able to do that we're not currently able to do in Vue 2. But yeah, right now we're refining the experience we already have, not introducing too many new features, but where it's still pretty lightweight, we're adding stuff. So we're relatively stable and polishing
I can go now. As people often comment, all of the frameworks are like kind of aligned. They have more in common than they have to break them apart. And I feel specifically like a kinship to VueJS, but we came into existence from opposing sides, if you will. Ember started out, you could say, as a monolith. That's why people have this idea that Ember is really big and hard to learn, because we're very upfront with what you need to know for an Ember app, while Vue started very small. With Glimmer.js, which we introduced at the last EmberConf, we started breaking Ember down. So the Glimmer.js library is just components. There's no router, there's no controllers, there's no anything. So you can start building that up. And one of our goals for the near future is to break Ember apart even more. So you can start with a Glimmer app and then npm install your way into Ember. That's like our tagline. And I'll kind of speak in taglines, and I apologize for that, but they're very useful. So, our big focus for Ember is developer experience. And we have a bunch of different projects because we have this holistic approach to web development. The other tagline is we want to be an SDK for the web. We want to be like the missing APIs when you want to build something. And depending on the specific project, we need different concerns. Like the Glimmer VM itself has been really focused on optimizing. They have the optimizing compiler. We're going to inline operations so we don't even ship parts of the VM to the browser. We do very aggressive ahead of time compilation for the templates, that sort of thing. The Ember CLI team is very focused on fast builds and rebuilds and the add-on ecosystem for a solid API, so you can just Ember install something. For example, if you want SSR, you can Ember install Ember Fastboot, and with a single command, you already have Fastboot. You run Ember server, and that's the Fastboot app running, which is something great. What's our policy of stability without stagnation means is that there's a lot of hidden engineering efforts. We changed the rendering layer of Ember twice with minimal impact for users. The syntax was the same. We first switched from a string rendering template engine to a DOM one, and then to Glimmer. And we reduced some apps by 30%, the bundle size of their apps and the templates, which is awesome. And we want to continue doing that sort of thing for, like across the projects. We want to keep modernizing Ember. I've already mentioned modules and tree shaking. We want to continue doing that. We recently introduced the router service with 2.15, which was released the previous week. We've been also betting on improving error messages. Now, when your broccoli build fails, you get a nice page on your browser with the stack trace and links and etc. We have, in my opinion, very good deprecation guides. When you get a deprecation, you get a link to a guide explaining what you need to do. We provide code mods for some deprecation, so you can automatically update. And we're also worried about API documentation and the guides. So there's a breadth of things to worry about, responsibilities. And each team tries to balance the different constraints always having in mind the developer experience. We want to be the glue. Ember is basically the glue that binds all of the packages, Backburner, Glimmer, RSVP, Router.js, etc. So you don't have to worry about that. You just have to Ember install your way to happiness and be productive and not have to worry about that. Yeah, and that's it. Because I just want to focus once again on we're very keen on modernizing Ember. It's hard work because Ember is quite old at this point, and we don't want to leave people behind, so it needs to be staggered. We need to introduce the new APIs, deprecate the old ones, provide support, and all of that, so people can more seamlessly move ahead. And it's a lot of work, but it's definitely a goal of the team.
So with Node, what do we optimize for? We've always optimized for performance first. Over the last couple of years, with the fact that Node has the largest module ecosystem of any of the platforms, we really had to shift that focus to stability and reliability, and reliability of the end users who are using all of the the modules in npm. So it's a big shift for Node to take that into consideration and make the changes to the platform that are needed. Thankfully we have the ethos in Node where only what we really need to put into the core of the platform gets put into core, and then intentionally by design we push complexity in the platform out to userland, to npm. We as an example of how we've shifted our focus from that raw just performance at any cost to focus on reliability and sensible defaults. We used to have uninitialized buffers in Node, and that was just done because it was the fastest way to do that based on our testing. But to sort of match end user expectations that, hey, I don't want to risk leaking any data. We shifted our buffer initialization to make sure that we zero fill that by default, and we're protecting the user base around Node. So we're following the path of least surprise.
So then the last question, if we could go briefly, maybe if you could say, if there's a call out that you could make to the community, if there's something that you'd want the community to help with or do, what would that be for your community?
For RxJS is docs. We need help with docs. Please contact Tracy about docs. On the technical side of it, I mean, there aren't a lot of new operators or anything we need to add. There's work to be done, but I think that we've kind of got that under control. It's more the documentation and just really good examples and tutorials and things like that. Because there's such a broad set of things you can do with RxJS, it's hard for a small group of people to cover all of those things you can do. Because I've used it in every single framework represented here except for Vue. Sorry, Vue, I haven't used Vue.
It'll come soon.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll come around.
I forgive you.
Deployed on everything from a smart TV to little handheld robotics things, to obviously in browsers and things like that. So it's everywhere, and we need examples of how to use it with everything from Node to all of these different frameworks. And that's a lot of work, and our small team cannot do it by themselves. We definitely need community support for that sort of thing.
Igor?
For Angular, RC for version 5 is coming soon. We slipped a little bit because of some bigger regressions that we discovered at Google. But as soon as RC is out, I would love the community to help us iron out the last minute bugs so that once we publish the final version, everything's super smooth and we have a good upgrade story just like we had with version 4. The other thing I would like to call out is just code of conduct and being nice. We've seen lots of that recently online where people got into unnecessary fights online. Just keep in mind that we're all people and we all have right to have opinions. And it's good to share your opinions, but also be mindful of how your opinions can affect other people. Keep that in mind.
Who's going next?
I can go next. Yeah, second that. We're all doing our best. We are just human beings. I will also say that in terms of documentation, as I'm a little bit biased as the curator of our docs, but if you see anything while reading the Vue docs that makes you confused, or if you encounter a problem and you're not able to quickly figure out what happened, open an issue on the docs, or submit a PR, or DM me on Twitter at CrispyFritz, whatever. Just reach out somehow and help it make us better so that the next person reading that doesn't run into the same thing you did.
Yeah, that's. And
be nice about it. Yeah, of course. I still have feelings.
Yeah. I think that goes across frameworks.
Yeah.
For Ember, we have a little pencil icon at the top of the guide that you can click and submit, and it's very helpful. And we consider a documentation bug like a bug. It's a bug that we have in our project and needs to be fixed. I think Frederick was going to say something. Sorry.
No, go ahead. You're on it.
So for Ember, I think we have pretty good community participation, but I'd like to urge people to participate in the RFCs, because that's the way that we shape Ember. Any new feature that needs to come to Ember or a deprecation we want to introduce goes through the RFC process. I can put a link on the show notes later. What that means is that there's a document explaining why that change should happen, and then the community discusses it, and then the Ember teams approve it or don't approve it. And the more you comment, the more you influence, and the more perspectives we have. And we might be missing something that you read the document and say, oh, I need something that isn't contemplated in this document. So please address that. And the other thing is, please write more blog posts and do Ember presentations at non-Ember events. We need more evangelization. We have a lot of Ember meetups and some conferences, and people share internally, but we need to branch out and try to preach, not to the choir, but to the general public. And I think that's it for us.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, everything that everyone said applies to the Polymer community as well. I'd say one thing that we could definitely be better at is just responding to everyone's. So we do get incoming stuff, and then some of it just kind of drops on the floor. We're a small team with a lot of elements and tools. So I think we need to be better about that. One thing that I'm excited about is just now that we're in the Polymer 2 world where everything is HTML-based, basically everything with HTML-based tooling, which is a pretty unique world to be living in for tooling. So we were the champions of a lot of that, and it was, what can Polymer do build tooling-wise or production optimization-wise was always kind of led up to, well, what do Polymer tools support? Now we're joining all of you, and there's a lot that's just kind of unlocked in terms of what can be done and how it plugs into the existing tools. So we're excited as a team to be experimenting with all this. I mean, now we're no longer the gatekeepers of what you can do with Polymer. So, I mean, I'm really excited to see the experimentation that's gone on so far. and I'm excited to see that continue and grow as we fit more into the community that already exists.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to give a quick shout out and say, like, as part of like the larger community, not just the Vue community, and in the spirit of branching out, like, thank you everyone for like all the communities. Like, Vue has learned a lot and continues to learn and like take ideas from other people. Sometimes like viciously steal. Like I find it very difficult to believe that we would have like hot reloading if React hadn't done it first. I think the same goes for JSX and some other ideas. For the style guide that we're developing, like, I've been looking at the Ember style guide, which a lot of people love, and you know, other style guides. A lot of people really love the strong conventions of Angular and Ember, which we're trying to learn lessons from. A lot of people really love the like fantastic linting support of React that we're also learning lessons from. Vue is obviously in many ways inspired by web components and things that Polymer has been working on. So thank you everyone for like all of your contributions to Vue, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah, plus 100.
But Chris, you didn't say you took anything from RxJS.
RxJS is kind of like a different beast, but we do have a VueRx package that allows you to
I've seen that.
That allows you to take like an RxJS subscription and just like plop it into your data, and now it's just part of the reactivity system. So I personally love Rx, and we certainly like it and care about it. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to leave you out.
You can hug me later when we meet in person.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good.
So I'd like to build on that, and just like, because I think that we have a really great community in the JS ecosystem, especially web. But what I'm missing is us reaching out beyond that, because there's a lot of UI being built for iOS and Android, and these are two giant platforms that some of us might wish we didn't even exist, but they do exist, and they're actually like growing rapidly, and they're huge, and there's actually a lot of innovation and really cool stuff happening there. So we're actually picking a lot of our new ideas up from those ecosystems. And for a long time, they were kind of missing out on what we were doing and all of our front-end frameworks. And eventually they caught on, and they learned, and they kind of incorporated it into their environments. But now they're also coming up with new ideas, especially around threading model that we don't really have, and like how can we incorporate those kind of things. But just reaching out and learning about those ecosystems, I think, is really important for us to even grow even further, so we don't become insular.
WebAssembly, that threading model, it's coming.
Yeah.
That we all shudder. I'm excited about
it. Next year is the year of WebAssembly on the desktop, right? It's gonna solve all our problems.
Yeah, all problems solved. Exactly.
Did everybody go? Dan, did you talk yet?
Yeah, I'll hop in, and the Node has charted a group inside of the project, dedicated to supporting community interest, community needs, and if you want to get involved with the Node.js project, a great way. We have both really supportive groups to enable participation in docs, as well as our Code and Learn program, which is a great way, primarily focused around tests and testing of the platform to get to know how to do core development with Node. My biggest ask, and I'm gonna click a link on the interactive thing, is I don't get to post links. Anyways, the NAPI, I mentioned it earlier. It's this low-level binding for native code. So before we get to WebAssembly, we've made improvements on the native code bindings in Node.js, And we have this experimental NAPI that we're still looking for more testing, more input on. So if you do n-API in Node.js, just Google that. Check out the docs on NAPI. We'd love if you're running native modules, native code with Node.js. Check out NAPIs. We'd love to get your feedback and port your native code to support NAPI and land that as our go forward approach that gives us that API stability with our underlying VM interactions.
Cool. Well, thank you everybody for joining. I think one of the most exciting things I learned today was that PWA is actually PWA.
Yeah, all of you are wrong. I'm pronouncing correctly.
Any conferences you're speaking at, in the future, just PWA. It's the best.
It is fun to say, yeah, to admit.
It's like a Rue or like, OIX. That's what I thought when we first said it.
I like the Bruce Lee pronunciation of it though, like PWA. It's good.
to be fair, I'm not the only person I've heard say it, and I don't know if I'm the first person that I've heard say it. So it might be one of those situations where it's just like a game of like where there's like some tiny community where like we heard it from someone, we assume like, oh, I guess you can pronounce it that way, and
hey Chris, would you?
And then the next person starts it.
What would you call an animated image on the web? How would you say that? How would you?
We're not going to play this game. We're not going to play this game.
Not skip anything format.
Well, but I PWA. I mean, let's just do that for now. I'm excited about everybody doing really cool things, and I always get really excited to see. I hope like the people who are on This.JavaScript, you guys take from these ideas and get to talk to each other, and hopefully we see like more awesome things because of this. I know always just conversations just ignite exciting ideas to actually happen. If you guys, if anybody's in the Bay Area tonight, we have Modern Web tonight. So you can go to meetup.com/modernweb, and you can see Jay Phelps from Netflix talking about WebAssembly. We also have Jeff Cross, who is formerly of the Angular core team, who's going to be talking about the Redux, basically NGRX in Angular, but the Redux pattern in Angular. And then we are also going to have Archana, who is talking about CSS. So it'll be a really good meetup. It's in Google. There were a lot of questions that weren't answered, so you can always continue the conversation on Twitter, #This.JS, or find all these folks on Twitter as well. For those of you who, women watching who want to get more involved, always feel free to reach out to me. We try to do a lot of things to help women in tech, whether you're getting started or whether you want to actually mentor or anything like that. You can email me, tracy@this.co, and I can figure out how to connect you or work together with you or anything like that. And I think besides that, we will have another one in about a quarter that is going to be covering the different browsers. So maybe we'll get somebody who talks about the server-side rendering related stuff at that point in time. And again, thank you again all for coming and listening. Yeah.
Thank you for hosting.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Bye.
Bye.